This is Karen with NewClevelandRadio.net, and it is time for a brand new podcast on New Cleveland Radio. It is called Grief, BeLIEF, and we sure hope that you will stay with us and share with us along the way. If you are watching this on Zoom, you see that we have a panel of 5 individuals. I will be their moderator. We're going to go in alphabetical order so you can know who each of them are. And as they tell you about themselves, I think you will get an idea of what grief BeLIEF is. And I want to thank this group for coming up with the name and being so responsive to providing this information to all of you. So I'm first going to introduce Alison Pena. Alison and I met through podmatch.com. She is a grief coach, plus, she's involved in so many things that as we get to know Alison, I think you all are going to be amazed. So Alison, let's go ahead and introduce yourself and let's get started.
So my name's Alison Pena. I call myself Bad Widow because after I lost my husband, I discovered all the assumptions people have about grief. And I decided that I was going to blow up those assumptions and correct them. I am a grief coach. I am I offer a membership group, and I've written a best-selling book called The Bad Widow Guide to Life After Loss, Moving Through Grief to Live and Love Again. So that's me, and I'm out of New York City.
Well, she didn't tell us that much about her, so we're going to start questioning her in a few minutes. Okay. Our next panelist is Candace Pollock, and some of you have been listening to her show, The Intentionality Gurus. And Candace, give us a little bit of a background.
So by day, I'm an attorney. I do estate planning. So I deal with death and disability and other things that tend to cause grief episodes. I didn't always recognize all of those things. And I have to admit that I probably was dealing with my clients' issues with a rational mind and certainly with a deep heart, but we can't always show that. And it wasn't until my husband passed away that I really had, my own deep sense of struggle and pain and so on. And the biggest challenge for me was that I couldn't think my way through it. I couldn't do what I do in my day job and navigate my way out because my thinking was muddled. I, didn't have energy and so on. I'm always somebody that relied on those strengths. And so I suffered. I didn't just have, heart pain. I suffered for a long, long time. And then I stumbled upon the grief recovery method. And that process was just so beneficial that I decided to become certified as an advanced grief recovery specialist, as will someone else on this group. And so the idea is I've become more sensitized to how my clients are dealing with it and some of the myths that Alison was alluding to. And one of the big issues for me that I recognize in my practice is how much estrangement there is and how that is a huge source of grief that often goes unspoken or addressed.
Well, welcome. Our next panelist is Carol Kalnow, and Carol and I have known each other a very long time. And what I'm finding interesting is that this is a very, very small world, how we connect. So Carol, go ahead and introduce yourself, and maybe I'll learn something new about you today.
One never knows. Thank you. Thank you for putting this together. And I'm honored to be sitting here on the panel with Alison, Candace, and excited to get to know Christy. My name is Carol Kalnow. I'm originally from Minneapolis, like Karen is, and we grew up together, but we won't say when we graduated or anything. And along the way, I met the love of my life. And we had a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful run But unfortunately, he had a very unexpected accident, lingered for 11 days, had to take him off of life support as I'm holding him in my arms and trying to walk the rest of the family members through what is going on and accepting the fact that we are going to lose him. That was 11 years ago. During that time, I was working in a very high-end dental practice. I was the administrator. It was my safe haven. I could close my door, I could cry, and I had the support of my coworkers. But as I was walking home at night, there were many times that I would walk over the Chicago River and wish that I could jump off the bridge. That's how low I was. And I sought out others that had gone through the loss of a spouse, the loss of someone dear, near and dear to them. And they're few and far between. They're hard to find. A group didn't feel like a good fit to me. I wanted the individual one-on-one contact. And as time went on and other friends were confronted with similar situations, the loss of a loved one, they sought me out and we started talking. Because of that, I became a coach. I'm a life, grief, and health coach, certified, went through the training, but I modify my bereavement grief coaching to the individual. I don't feel that there's any one right or wrong way. And I think there are many. I've learned so much from Alison and Candace just in the conversations that we have had and the similarities between the way that we do work with our clients. But I try to modify it based on who they are. I believe that grief is very individualized and there isn't a stamp that says, okay, here you are. I was frozen. I was frozen in time for 2 years. I couldn't read. For 2 years, I couldn't talk about it. I also feel that there is a loss of community in the world that we live in today, where it used to be that we had a large community that we could rely on in the neighborhood or the church or the synagogue or the mosque. And they don't really exist like they used to. So I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And again, because of this, I have pursued this in my retirement and find it very cathartic for me. I feel that it's rewarding for the clients that I'm working with, but there's so much that I get out of it too, just in working with them. And so again, I'm thankful to be here and I'm thankful to be with you all. And there's so much for me to learn from you. And I hope that I bring something to the table as well.
And we have Christy Anderson, and I'm so excited to add Christy to this panel because Christy and I share a lot of commonalities, which I wouldn't have thought of when I first met her. And I think a lot that she's going to bring to this group is going to be very healing for me. So Christy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, I'm so excited to be here with all of you. I am so excited to learn from all of you. And Karen, thank you so much for asking me to be here. I'm thrilled. I'm just really excited. It's going to make me cry. But anyway, I'm so excited. So the way I ended up becoming a grief recovery specialist, I had a series of very intense losses, very heartfelt, intense losses, 3 of them within 13 months. They were just about 6 months apart. The first one was my mom, and I call my mom my first best friend. She was my safe place. She was just my everything. I adored her. And to lose her was really hard. The day was hard. My dad had dementia. And so while I was so honored and thrilled and so grateful to be able to be the one to tell my dad that it was the day my mom was going to die, it was just really hard. And then again, like to be able to hold my mom's hand was just such an honor. And I was so grateful. It was just such a sacred moment, but it was so painful. And then after the day is over, it just goes on and on. And it was just so incredibly difficult. And then fast forward 13 months later, we lost our dad. And that was very difficult too, in a different way, because my dad and I were not real close. I didn't have a great relationship with my dad. So it was very conflicting. While I was, again, so grateful that he was put into hospice, and while it was those conflicting feelings, like I didn't want him to be in hospice, but I was so grateful he was there because he was being well cared for and he was not in pain. They were taking, care of all that. So there's all these conflicting feelings. And I wanted to be there when he died, and I wasn't. I missed it. I wasn't able to be there. But honestly, knowing my dad, it's not surprising that we weren't there when he died. But then, after the day of him dying, it was just all kinds of conflicting feelings because I felt sad, really sad, but I felt like I didn't have the right to be sad because I didn't have a close relationship with him. So it was very confusing and conflicting. And then right in the middle of those two losses was the loss that was incredibly excruciating and devastating. And that was an estrangement loss of a dearly loved living child. And that was so painful. I use the word excruciating because that really is the only way to explain it. It was just incredibly painful. It was out of the blue, completely blindsided, didn't expect this one bit. This child has my grandchildren. I didn't know if I would ever see my grandchildren again. And I went to therapy. I even saw not just therapy, I went to a grief counselor as well. And both were amazing. They helped me. They helped me in a lot of ways. They helped me be able to tell my story. They helped me be able to be sad when I was sad and scream in the car when I needed to scream in the car. They helped me do all of these things. But I still was carrying around this excruciating, heavy pain all the time. And I felt stuck. I just felt stuck. And I just remember saying to my husband over and over again, I need to do something. I don't know what it is, but I need to do something. And through a series of events, I found the Grief Recovery Institute. And as soon as I found it, I went there and I signed up and I did that process. And it was so transformative to me. I wasn't carrying around that heaviness any longer, and I could remember happy things and not have all these horrible, awful, excruciating, painful things come up. And it was truly life-changing. It brought me to a place where I could feel happy again. And I just knew that I wanted to do this with other people, that I wanted, it had helped me so much. I wanted to help other people. And that's how I ended up becoming a grief recovery specialist. And that's how I met Candace.
Well, I first want to thank all of you for your introductions. I've wanted to do this podcast for a little over 6 years. And that was due to the loss of my mother. And I didn't know that grief was individualized because my family kept expecting me to grieve in certain ways. And once I found out that I was one of millions of people out there who are suffering because people expect them to grieve or stop grieving, I knew this was a conversation we had to have. And so the four of you have very definite issues that brought you to becoming coaches. And I want to thank you for that. I've talked to all of you in the past. I've watched other podcasts that you've been on. And I know our viewers who are out there listening, because we have people logged in over here. They just haven't put their names up. But I know we are helping a few of those people. So, Alison, I'm going to start with you. When you finally made this decision, yes, I think I should be a grief coach. Did you have any opposition from family, friends, or even maybe therapists that you had sought out?
Sometimes it's not you choose it, it chooses you. So my a husband died in my arms at home after fighting pancreatic cancer for 11 months. And suddenly I was being treated like I was broken, and honestly felt like I was broken. And all these things kept going wrong. I couldn't focus. I had no energy. I couldn't deal with answering the phone or calling someone. There were these little things that were so easy before that I couldn't do anymore. And so I couldn't find the resources that I needed to move myself through my own grief. And I began creating what I call nets, which were solutions for all these little things that were going wrong. So because we had 11 months of medical bills, I was scared to open the mail. And I almost had the lights turned off more than once. These sound like stupid things. You know, these are things that anybody can do, but when you're grieving, they aren't things that you can do necessarily. And so I began creating these nets and moving myself through my grief, and came up with 5 steps that people can use to move through any loss. And they were things like, if you are exhausted, but you need to increase your self-care, make a list when you have energy, and then you can just go to the list. So it was one thing after another, but it chose me. I thought, okay, I am not finding what I need. I am dealing with all these people who have no understanding of what's going on, who are giving me really bad advice. And there's nobody out there that I could find who was saying, what do you do when you go to a holiday party and you burst into tears in the middle of dinner? What happens when you do that? So I created my own thing. I actually am not a certified coach. I'm a widow. And I'm a widow who sort of figured out my own path through. And it's 5 steps. It is reconnect with yourself, re-engage in the world, reinvent your identity, rebuild your networks, and reset your path forward. And they're really specific action steps, because what I found was a lot of the grief resources were spotty. Someone to help you with finances, someone to help you with feelings, someone to help you with this, someone to help you with that. And also didn't answer how long grief lasts. September 10th was 6 years. I was a mess the week before. I didn't cry the whole week, which is what the 5th year looked like. But I was not in good shape. And so there's not an understanding that it lasts a long time. It changes and morphs and stuff, but it lasts so long, and you need different things at different times. So it chose me, short answer. I got myself through, and then I started showing other people what I did, and they followed what I had done, and it works.
So I love the comment that it didn't find you, you found it. Okay. But you found it because, like many of us, we couldn't find it anywhere else. We had to develop it for ourselves. And
Yep.
and I know in 2 occasions when I've gone through a major loss, it took me to publicly go out and almost stand on my rooftop and yell, hey, I know I'm not alone. Who can help me? And sadly, I've been told twice, help yourself. So this is energizing me to know that there are people like the 4 of you who are out there and sharing your experiences in helping others. Candace, you're a busy attorney. And and yet you decided to take this step. How does it work with your day life? Or is this your day life?
And by this, you mean the grief recovery?
Grief
work?
coach, yeah. Yeah.
It is part of my daily life, just recognizing it, and just anchoring to the estrangement. I had a lovely couple, people I'm very fond of that are my clients, and they had a daughter estrange herself from them, and they didn't understand it and so on, and they were seeking counseling, outside resources, and didn't feel that that was quite targeting the kinds of things they were expressing. And then after my training, I was able to recognize, I was totally obtuse prior to that, but after that, I was able to recognize you're grieving. And just being able to give a name to it was a little bit of a relief for them in terms of, they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. And they would, they're very social in certain groups. And when other friends would share some of the happy announcements, a new baby or somebody graduating and so on, they could notice that people would hold back and get awkward suddenly, or maybe not share. And it was just a whole bunch of things. So after my experience with it, I was more sensitive. I think I'm a reasonably sensitive person, but there were so many nuances to grief that I was unaware of because I was in my problem solving mode and I was looking at a different part of the equation. And so after going through it, and I'd only had 2 losses and 3 in my life prior to that, so it's not like I had a lot of experience with it. But just being able to get in better touch with how other people process loss. And as I said, even some of the good things that have a saying goodbye, moving to a different path into retirement, into a nursing home with disabilities and so on. It all has that mixed feelings that Christy was referencing.
So Carol, we know what led you down this path. Yet, how difficult was it for you to finally say, hey, I have to help other people so I can help myself?
Interesting question, because my husband was not my first loss. I lost my grandparents, his parents, my parents, a very dear friend. I learned a lot from those. I probably learned the most from my mother-in-law, taking care of her and knowing how to deal with it, talking with my husband about it. So it wasn't something that just all of a sudden, because of the loss of Ron, I knew what to do. It was a culmination of all of this over the court. I was losing someone on an average of every 8 to 12 months for about 6 years. And it weighs on you. This is something that I refer to as a sorority or a fraternity that you would not even want your worst enemy to join. And yet here we are, part of this. And so in doing that and dealing with Ron, and I was dealing with this.
As I hear the 3 of you so far, if you hadn't gotten into coaching,
I think we're breaking up. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you, but I think Karen froze.
Okay, all right, I'll keep going. As I was walking through this and my husband lingered for 11 days, everyone turned to me. And it was one of those things that it happened. The first phone call I got, I realized the reality of the seriousness of my husband's situation. And all of a sudden, because everyone loved him, and when I say everyone, there were over 300 people at his funeral. They were outside. They now were congregating in the hospital. So I had no privacy. I would have to walk past them just to go to the bathroom, and everyone would turn to me. His children turned to me. My children turned to me. His brother and sister turned to me. I had to hold everyone. My family turned to me. I had to be the strong one through all of this. And how are you the strong one through this when you're going through so much yourself? I was a zombie walking back and forth to the hospital. I couldn't even go home because and have privacy because there were people living in my house. They were there because they wanted to be close to him. And as we're going through this, people would say, you're so strong. And how can you think of that? And we thank you so much for what you're doing for us, that it opened my eyes to it. But like I said, I was still working full time. And I did not get into this as a real occupation until after I retired. I only did it on a request basis. People would ask me, would you talk to my sister? Would you talk to my brother? Would you talk to my whatever? They've lost a sibling, they've lost a parent, they've lost a spouse. And because of that, to Alison's point, it found me. I didn't find it, it found me. But I learned from all the experiences that I had and the different ways that things that I did very differently because of my husband's situation, because of what I learned through his mother and being by her side. And so I learned how to comfort my husband, what questions to ask. When my father was in his last 2 weeks of his life, I was by his side. I was able to work remotely by his side and be there. And the same with my mother. But again, it's only because I had experienced other losses. I can go all the way back to my grandfather when I was in college. And I remember kissing him and thinking how cold he was. And it really resonated with me for a very long time that he was cold. But in the Jewish tradition, you don't embalm them, you keep them cold until their actual ceremony. And so when I bent over to kiss him for the last time, I was taken aback. I wasn't prepared for it. So again, there were all these things growing up that I learned through experience. And again, to Alison's point, I truly believe because of all this, it found me. It found me. And I'm a very different person than I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I've been without my husband for 11 years. I still grieve his loss. I still have moments when I break down. I view it more as we go into a recovery mode. We never completely heal from it. He will always be in my heart, but I also know my heart is large enough to let others in too, and it hasn't blocked my heart. And I think that's something that when we lose someone, we have to learn that we are here, we have a life, and we have those that love us and that we love. And we need to keep our heart and our mind open to them, but we also need to allow ourselves to grieve. And even if it takes the rest of our lives to grieve, to take those moments in time and let yourself grieve. But also remember to love, laugh, and live.
So, Christy, your story starts with loss. And the story is never going to change, but you talked about estrangement, something that we've had in common. And I think some of our listeners may be listening and saying, oh, I understand the loss of a parent, the loss of a spouse, the loss of a child, but we don't think of estrangement as being a loss. In fact, sometimes we think of, oh, it's a chosen on both parts, but that's not the case. So was there a catalyst that pushed you into your training? Was it because of the loss of your parents, or was it more because of the estrangement, or a combination of all?
Yeah, it was a combination of everything. But the estrangement is a little bit different because they're still alive. And I think that when you have somebody who has died, I think it's really important to be able to, so when somebody dies, you don't quit having a relationship with them. That relationship goes on and on and on because they've been, important and special to you. So they live on in your heart and in your mind. And I think it's really important to try to make sure that that relationship stays as healthy as it can. And it's the same thing with estrangement, but it's a little bit different because they're still there. I just I don't have any contact. So it's a different feeling. I don't know what's ever going to happen. Something could happen and I'm not expecting it. And so I'm never quite sure what's going on. Where with the death of a loved one, you know that you're the one kind of in charge of keeping that relationship healthy in your mind and in your heart. So it's a little bit different.
So as I hear all four of you, and I have to apologize, we lost total internet for about a minute or so. I'm on two different internet services, and the people who were listening live, their computer is totally out. So we're not going to be able to get questions from them. But as I'm listening to all of you, I'm amazed that day after day, you can meet with clients, whether in person, on Zoom, in some format, and continue to heal when you hear their stories. So I'll let anybody jump in. It's like, how do you keep yourself from feeling their pain?
I don't think you do. I think we can feel it and empathize. We don't necessarily own their pain, but we can be a better service by helping them without the getting enmeshed in the pain.
I agree with Candace, and I also feel that I know in working with my clients that I share with them. I share with them the pain that I have felt, so they know that they're not alone in their pain, and the guilt that they feel, or the lack of attentiveness, everything that's going on. I don't know, although grieving is individualized, I do believe that we all go through very similar situations. It may not be in the same order. We may skip a few, but we all have experienced some of the same issues and questions and concerns and doubts. And so by sharing and talking, and I think a great deal of it is the ability to communicate with them, to share with them, but to also bring questions to them, to challenge them into thinking about, well, maybe if you thought about this, or how about, giving them different suggestions on how to deal with the grief or the insecurities or the guilt or the questioning that they're having, and let them know that they're not alone. And again, just like I have those suicidal thoughts, and people are saying, I want to end my life, I have nothing to live for. My children are grown, and my children are grown. I have no greater joy in life today than my grandchildren. I could have cut that short because I didn't want to be a burden to them. So I'm not afraid to share my feelings with them when they're talking. So, and to Candace's point is that I'm not owning their grief, but I'm acknowledging what I went through and recognizing that theirs is real.
Yeah, I would say that the idea that we quantify our grief, that we like judge our grief against another person's grief. And I remember after my husband died, there was a friend of mine who was going through a really bad divorce, and she was suffering. And she said, oh, I shouldn't talk to you about this because your grief is so much worse than mine. And that is honestly crazy to me. So much. And I said, not for you. For you, this is pretty awful. And so the thing that I see all the time is people being judged, people getting advice based on somebody else's experience. And the hardest thing about writing my book was not to do that, was to have the book be founded in the stories so that people who read my book would go, wow, she does know this. But saying, my experience is like yours. No one person's experience is ever like any other person's experience. There are commonalities. But when you compare and contrast, you know, it turns into like a one-upmanship thing sometimes. Well, but my husband died. Yours is just a divorce. And you don't say that, but that is how it feels.
Or it's just a pet.
No,
or
a lot of
just a
times,
pet.
go ahead.
No, I was just saying, or it's just a pet, you know, those kinds of things that quantifying. Yes.
Yep.
Many times I'll refer back to the prophet. I'm talking about the depth of sorrow is based on the depth of joy, and the depth of joy is based on the depth of sorrow. And as individuals, we only know that based on our own experiences. So there is no judgment in bereavement coaching. There is no judgment in life coaching, but there are shared situations. But again, it's based on the depth of the individual experience. And so, yeah, I agree with you that that person that went through the divorce, that is the depth of their pain, and that's the depth of their sorrow, and they are grieving. I went through that with my own sister, and she would say to me, oh, you don't understand. You don't understand. Yours was a death. Mine is a divorce. And it's like, no, the depth is how we feel it as an individual, the impact that it has on us. And there's no way to gauge that. One is more or less than another, but they are equally as devastating to the individual walking through it, that journey.
In 2001, I was estranged from my oldest son, who was 11 years old, and went to a therapist. Therapist had no concept of what to say to me other than, you know, you should go to court and fight to get your son back. And it was like, but you don't understand. And what she didn't understand was my ex-husband had more money than anybody around. I could go fight and he'd let me fight and see me lose money. So I joined a support group. It probably was the worst thing other than the therapist, because in this support group, there were 6 of us all being estranged from a child, all different ages. And that's what it was every week when we got together. It was a competition. And when I left the group, they asked me, why would I do that? And I said, because we're not helping each other. We're making each other worse. And at that point, I had been with this group for a year, and I said, I'm going to suffer no matter what, but I don't have to suffer worse being in the group. And that felt like an estrangement, because they were the only people that I thought I had something in common with.
Well, you had a loss on top of a loss.
Absolutely. And what I want our listeners to understand is that there are so many losses. And Candace, we've talked about this in your podcast numerous times. It can be the loss of a job. It can be the loss of your home, or even a precious sentimental piece of jewelry that somebody has given you, means so much to you. And all of a sudden you look down one day and it's no longer there.
Well, COVID and you know, being isolated, all of that, you know, there's just any kind of change. Christy, give me the phrase. I can't remember the exact phrase. Any change in a familiar pattern or behavior.
Yes, you got it.
So,
Yeah.
you know, that is likely to trigger some kind of grief response, that mixed bag of feelings where maybe have some relief that somebody's no longer in pain if we're talking about a death, but also having, you know, sorrow for having them pass away.
Yeah.
Take
So
it even a step further. What about a child who loses their lovey? And what is the normal response from a parent? Oh, don't worry, I'll go get you another one.
replace the loss.
That child is grieving the loss of their lovey.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or like the first time that I was just thinking about, like my daughter who she was a pacifier baby, and to have to get rid of her pacifier. And I was like, oh, that was probably her first loss, was having her pacifier. You know, we did it, you know, the right way, but still, you know, that was probably her first loss. At the Grief Recovery Institute, they talk about how grief is experienced at 100%. So we're all grievers, and when we're grieving at 100%. The difference is the intensity and the time. So I think that it's really important. The other thing we talk about too is that all relationships are unique. Therefore, all grief experiences are unique, and to never, ever judge them. Because like Alison said, you end up one-upping. They are the good guy or you're the bad guy, or the other way around. Or, the other thing I think is important too is to not judge yourself against yourself. Like somebody who has lost a pet and they also lost a parent, and that pet was much harder for them to lose than the parent, and they feel horrible about that. But if you look at the relationship behind it, the reasons behind it, it makes sense. So it's really important not to judge anybody's losses, not even against yourself.
And again, I'll take it even a step further. As a society, I don't think we're there for people that are grieving. We're very good at being there for people when there's a joy, or there's laughter, or there's a birth, or there's a marriage. But as soon as there's a loss, we don't know as a community again how to be there for one another and to show that support, continued support. I remember people saying to me, well, come on, I'll take you out to dinner. Come on. And I would go, I hope that you're there when I'm ready, because right now I'm not. And I appreciate it. But please hear me when I say, I hope you're there when I'm ready. And so again, you can't be forced to grieve at a certain pace. You can't be forced to grieve in a certain way. You can learn coping skills. You can learn how to carry the pain in your everyday life and live. And that's what I think our community has let us down on, in the fact that we become the unintended consequences of becoming the mobility that we have in the world that we have today. Without the family not being there, we have the internet, we have the text, but we don't have that personal interaction. We don't have the neighborhood, we don't have the community. And I think it's incumbent upon us as coaches, as counselors, to start encouraging others to help educating the public and how to help those that are grieving, just by what we're doing here today, we're coming at it from totally different viewpoints, but a lot of similarities at the same time. And what works for me may not work for you, and what works for you may not work for the other person, but together, collaborating, working together, finding goals that we can pull it all together with is the beauty of this group. That, going back to the question that you asked early on, Karen, I learn from my clients, and I learn how to help them in their journey by listening to them and trying to work through some of their issues that they're having in a very positive manner. Because a loss is a loss, and that you carry with you the rest of your life, whether you want to or not. I'm sorry, it's just there.
What I find interesting, when you lose a spouse or a parent, family and friends seem to come out of the woodwork to be there, whether you've seen them last week or 10 years ago. And like you said, Carol, they're not necessarily there when you need them. And I don't know if it's because our society has changed or not, but I do know that when my father passed in 2004, everybody came out because of my mother. When my mother passed away, not so many people came out. And
I think she froze.
Yep.
Did any of you experience something similar to that?
Well, I was going to say that I was going to build on what you were talking about. Sometimes I think just as a society, and I imagine it's international, that we're all ill prepared for these losses, and we have all sorts of funny ideas about what it's supposed to be like. And so those family communities or neighborhoods or religious communities and so on aren't necessarily going to be artful in that support.
Correct.
And so I think it would be better if we could somehow raise awareness around the idea of what grief is, what basically Karen had the idea behind this podcast, so that we can normalize some of the things that need to be normalized and maybe marginalize some of the less artful things that are just exacerbating the pain that a lot of people feel. You know, I had several friends who had miscarriages, and don't worry, you can have another child. So it's in the vein of what you're saying, like, okay, let me just check that box. You'll get another lovey or the pacifier or pet. And well-intentioned, certainly, but totally misplaced.
Well,
I totally agree with you.
and that was the misunderstandings that I was speaking about at the beginning. You know, people think they know what to say. They think they know what to do. They're doing the best they can. And honestly, they're screwing it up a lot of the time because they don't actually know. And so
There's so
making
many-
that assumption is actually hurtful and damaging at times.
There were many times that I would just hold up my hand and I would say, there are no words. When somebody was starting to say something that was so irrelevant or even hurtful, not realizing it was hurtful, I would just go, there are no words.
Yep. I also think people are very scared of grief. Like it might rub off. They might they might catch it, and they don't understand how long it takes. So, you know, you were talking about community, people coming out right after, but in fact, there's devastating grief for a year. In the second year, it gets real, and then it's 0 to anger. But in the second year, everybody's gone.
Exactly.
So how do you set up the network so everything's not landing on 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 people, but that there's some continuous support going forward? And honestly, I would say for 5 years.
Well,
5 years.
Arrangement, like Christy was saying, I don't think it follows that timeline, does it?
No.
Yeah.
No,
So,
every situation's different. So,
and not just maybe being afraid that they're going to catch it, but I have the sense that people might be worried that you might have an emotional outburst that would be awkward for them, you know? And,
Yep.
And tell me where I'm wrong, Christy, but I know from my clients that I originally mentioned that people were just, reluctant to share their happy news because they thought it would make things more awkward. I don't know if you experienced that.
yeah, I mean, I think there's this desire for us as grieving people to want to be accepted, or just as people, really, to want to be accepted by others. So we start just behaving like we're okay when we're really not. And so it kind of falls under that category. You just like, well, I've just got to be careful. And you're not okay, and it's not really your job to be careful. But
it's okay not to be okay.
Right, but we do it in order because our society is so uncomfortable with grief, and they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to handle it. They've been taught these things that intellectually these comments might be true, but when you're dealing with somebody who's hurting, an intellectual comment is not helpful. You need to speak to the heart. So, but as the griever, you want to be accepted. So you start just acting like you're okay when you're around people when you're not. And so you start shoving those emotions away and away and away, and they can only be shoved away for so long. They're eventually going to come out. So
Yep.
I don't know if I answered your question, Candace. That's
totally. Well, and I remember vividly when my husband passed, I was doing a speaking event at the end of the year, and somebody that I hadn't seen in a couple of years came up and said, "How are you doing?" and so on. And I was just like a leaky sponge. I, just say my name and I would just burst into tears. But I was in a professional setting, so I, had to maintain my composure. But with this person who I had known as a pretty good friend back in the day, I sputtered. My husband passed away, and so we got over that. I had to go do the speaking thing. fast forward a year, I'm at the same event. I'm not speaking this time, but I run into him again. And to me, it had not been a year. It was like it was the day before. And he said, "How are you doing?" And I said it again. And he goes, "Oh yeah, you told me that last year." Okay. So I am going to shut down. I'm not going to let that show again. And it hurts. But, he's a good person. He doesn't mean to, didn't mean to be that way. Nothing about it was intentional, but maybe we can all raise our awareness around hearing what that human being is up to.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Alison.
A friend and I, and she does trauma work specifically. So I do, practical steps moving forward. She does trauma work. And so we started a meetup in New York, July 28th, because we thought, okay, people who are grieving, they need self-care, they need connection, and they need community. So we do 2 virtual and 1 live event a month. This group now has 114 people in it. I mean, hungry for basically, if you had these 3 elements and you were grieving, you would have like the baseline of support to make it through.
Well, that's what I'm hoping this podcast will do for so many. And hopefully we can, create communities. I mean, that is important because all of us, whether we are experiencing grief at this moment, it is inevitable. And grief can be over so many different things. And so I want people to remember that when somebody is hurting, it's not up to us to judge, to say they should or they shouldn't. We're there to give them support. So that's what we're going to do monthly. Once a month, we're going to have a podcast like this, and each of you are going to take each month and lead the group, which I'm excited about. In the meantime, I'm going to figure out what is going on with the internet in my community. It just keeps knocking me off the air and knocking the other computer off as well. So we'll have to get that fixed. So our apologies to those of you who are watching this in live stream and those of you who watch it in the future. If you go to the show notes, there will be information about each of the panelists. And there will be a way for you to contact them if you have questions, or you can send them directly here to New Cleveland Radio. And again, I thank each and every one of you for putting your hearts out for us, because it's not always easy to recant what you're going through. And you all are 4 of my favorite people. So thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you all soon.